What's up, everybody? My name is Raymond. I'm the owner of Paul's Watch Repair in Sacramento, California, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about the vintage watch market. I'm a watch dealer and a watchmaker located in Sacramento, California. Things might be different in different parts of the world. I can only speak for what I'm experiencing here where I'm at. So just a little bit of background. I've been in this business pretty much all my life, growing up into this family business. I've been doing watch trade shows for at least 18 years, the IWJG, Worldwide Trader, and the NAWCC. I first started dealing with vintage watches, and the market started slowing down for vintage wristwatches around 2018, 2019. During the pandemic in 2020, everybody at first was very scared because of uncertainty. They didn't know, how things were going to turn out. And as it happened, a lot of people in 2020 made a lot of money. A lot of people invested money in cryptocurrency and stocks, and some of those just exploded overnight. So a lot of people made money in that, and then a lot of people started small businesses during 2020 and became very successful. So there was a lot of new money in 2020, and a lot of the people coming in with new money, they began to become interested in watches, but not necessarily vintage watches, primarily modern watches. And more of the modern watches that they were interested in were the hype pieces or steel sports models, like from Rolex, from AP, from Patek, from Vacheron. So in 2020 we saw prices spike on modern sports watches, and those primarily were in stainless steel sports models, like the Rolex Daytona, Rolex Submariner. Now, during 2020, the watch trade shows closed down, and for a long time, trade shows were closed. So, for us, we were selling a lot of vintage watches at trade shows, and we had our main customers that were buying vintage watches were from Japan, from China, and some European countries like Germany, Italy. And due to the pandemic and everything being shut down, the watch shows were shut down, so a lot of that stopped. So a lot of the buyers that were coming from overseas here to the United States to buy vintage watches, they couldn't come. So that affected the market. And even after watch trade shows opened back up, and we don't see those buyers anymore coming from Asian countries and European countries. Another thing that's really affected the vintage watch market is the devaluation of the currency. So especially like the Japanese yen is at a 30-year low, and the Japanese market was always a strong market for vintage watches. They were always coming here to the US to buy vintage wristwatches. So a lot of the watches that you see for sale available online, lowest prices now, is coming out of Japan. So there's other things that affected the vintage watch market in 2022. War in Ukraine. Then we had other issues with the stock market pretty much taking a huge downturn, and also cryptocurrency falling and things like that. So that affected the watch market overall. But because people were, like, the last 2-3 years focused more on hyped pieces and more modern watches, they kind of completely forgot about vintage watches. This is what I've seen for the last 4 years since 2019. People that do want vintage watches, they want them to be in mint condition. People have the right to buy what they like, but definitely there's so many good vintage pieces out there, and a lot of people are just not buying them because they want everything to be perfect. And if you're a vintage buyer, one thing you have to understand that when you're buying a watch that's 70, 80, 90 years old, it cannot be 100% perfect as from day one. So that's one thing to take into consideration. But I do see a lot of potential clients for vintage pieces passing up on pieces. Just sometimes they find just one little flaw, like for example on vintage Rolex Datejust, if one of the small luminous plots on the hour markers is missing, they'll just pass on the whole watch and not buy it because of that, just little things like that. Or if some of the lume is missing from a hand, they won't buy the watch because of that. So what that has caused, it's made us dealers, like when we buy vintage watches, people come into our shop wanting to sell vintage watches, so we're looking at it from the customer's point of view, and if the watch is not pretty much perfect, we pass on it. And so that's one of the things that's really affected the vintage watch market, because the buyers have become more picky. So us as dealers, we have to be more picky too when we're buying. We have to be more selective. So we get a lot of clients walking in every day trying to sell watches, and we pass on a lot of them just because we know that it might be very difficult for us to resell. So definitely for somebody that appreciates vintage watches, this is such a good time right now to buy vintage watches for great prices. There's many out there. Find a dealer who you trust, even if it's a private party. If it's somebody you've done business with before, that person, if something ever goes wrong, that there's some sort of recourse. You can go back in case there's an issue with something and not have a problem. You can go back to them and they'll make it right if an issue arises. But now is really a good time to buy vintage watches. There are a lot of great vintage watches out there, including higher end watches like Rolex. You can go on eBay and buy Submariners for around $7,000. And I'm talking about older models, but still is a good time for somebody that loves and appreciates vintage watches to get into it now. I don't know where the market will go from here. I definitely cannot speculate. But one thing that I tell people, if you like a vintage watch and the person you're buying it from stands behind it with the warranty and with the making sure it's authentic and everything, and they will stand behind it, then you should have no issues purchasing it. One thing to keep in mind when you find a vintage watch too that you've been looking for, nobody's making these vintage watches anymore. If it was made 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, it's not being manufactured anymore. So if you find one that you like, don't necessarily look for one to be 100% in mint condition. It's watches are kind of like human beings. We get old, and you get into your 40s and then you wake up in the morning and your knees are hurting and things like that. Well, same thing with vintage timepieces.